The sky over Denton County burned the color of a wound that wouldn't close. A woman stood alone in front of a barn that leaned like it was tired of standing. Silver hair loose. Wind smelling of dry grass and coming rain. 62 years old, and she had not spoken a full sentence to another human being in 3 days. She didn't think that was unusual anymore. Inside the corral, a horse paced like something that had forgotten why it was caged. Black where the light didn't touch him. Brown where it did. Scars running across his chest. Old and pale and crossing each other in a pattern that made no sense. Not wire, not teeth. Something else entirely. He swung his head toward the fence and showed her his eyes. Too knowing, too damaged to be ordinary wildness. She didn't move toward him, didn't move away. She just stood there in the last copper light of evening. And then, without planning to, the way you breathe without deciding, she let 3 low notes leave her lips. A whistle, soft, rising and falling. The horse stopped. Not gradually, not the slow settling of an agitated animal. He stopped like the sound had reached through his skin and pulled something inside him into stillness. And Nora Calloway's hand went to her mouth because she recognized it for what it was. Grief answering grief. She had thought she was only doing a favor for a sick neighbor. She had thought she was only filling 3 empty weeks with labor instead of silence. She had not thought the truth had been locked in a barn 40 yards from her own front door for nearly 5 years, waiting for the sound of her dead son's whistle to finally come home. The house Nora lived in had 4 rooms, and every one of them was too large. She had learned this early, in the first weeks after the accident. That size was a form of cruelty when you were the only thing left to fill it. The kitchen table seated 6. She ate standing at the counter, a bowl of soup she sometimes forgot to taste. The hallway had 3 coat hooks, hers, Robert's, Owen's. She had never taken their coats down. She could not explain this if pressed. She simply could not. Robert had been 58 when the car went off the road. Owen had been 31, recently married, recently happy in a way that had made Nora begin to believe the world was actually safe. Both gone on a night in November, on a road they had driven 100 times. In weather that was bad, but not terrible. On a curve that should have held them. The official report said loss of control on a wet road. No other vehicle involved. She had never believed it. She had no evidence to disbelieve it. Only the small, cold certainty that lived below her sternum. Below argument. Below reason. The feeling that something was left uncounted. She had eventually stopped saying so, because people began to look at her differently when she said it. That particular kind of silence that follows. The one that means they've decided something about you. So she kept the feeling inside. And it kept her awake. And the years went by. And the house stayed large. Neighbors brought food at first. Then they stopped. The town of Sawyer's Bend was not unkind. It was busy with its own living, the way small towns are. Nora understood. She did not hold it against anyone. She had her garden, her chickens, her 3 mornings a week at Darlene Foss's feed store on the edge of town, where she signed invoices and said almost nothing to anyone and went home again. It was enough to keep breathing. It was not enough to feel alive. There was one more thing she had not told anyone. Owen's wife, Carrie, had been 6 weeks pregnant when the accident happened. Nora had known. Owen had told her 2 days before. Quietly in the kitchen, with a kind of cautious joy that belongs only to people who are afraid to celebrate too loudly, in case the world takes it back. The world took it back anyway. Carrie had moved to her sister's place in Amarillo after the funeral. They still exchanged cards at Christmas. Brief and careful. The kind of correspondence between 2 people who share the deepest wound imaginable and cannot bear to look directly at it. Nora kept Owen's coat on that hook, and sometimes she put her hand on it on her way down the hall, and did not let herself think too long about what it meant that the coat still smelled faintly of him after all this time. Or maybe she had imagined that. Maybe grief manufactures its own evidence. She could not be sure anymore. Silas Pruitt called on a Tuesday morning in late September. She had known Silas since before Robert, since the early years when she and Robert had first built their place out on the county road. And Silas had shown up with a casserole dish and a handshake that meant he intended to be permanent. He had been a large, sun-creased man then, loud in the way of people who laugh easily. He was 81 now, and the illness had taken most of the large out of him. She could hear it in the phone call, the careful way he was breathing, the pauses that were not hesitation, but conservation. Congestive heart failure. The doctors wanted him in Dallas for 6 weeks. His son was in Portland with problems of his own. The ranch hand had quit 3 months ago. Coldwater Ranch. 12 acres. Some cattle. Some chickens. One very difficult horse. Would be swallowed alive if it sat unattended. He asked if she would consider. She almost said no. The polite kind of no that lets the person asking know you are sorry, but the answer is still no. Instead, she heard herself say, "When do I start?" She surprised herself. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after the call ended, holding the phone, looking at nothing. Then she thought it was probably just arithmetic. The farm would give her something to do with her hands, and her hands had been restless for nearly 5 years with no sufficient task. That was all. Nothing more complex than that. She told herself that with some conviction. She arrived at Coldwater Ranch on a Thursday morning. The sight of it settled into her chest like a stone. The fences needed mending in at least 4 places she could count from the driveway alone. The barn roof sagged where something heavy had landed on it and stayed. The yard between the house and the outbuildings was overgrown with something yellowish and brittle. The water trough near the cattle pen was green around the rim with algae. Silas had not been managing this place. Silas had been surviving it, which was a different thing entirely. And now even that had stopped. She was standing in the dry yard taking inventory when a truck pulled up behind her. Late model, white, clean and spotless in a way that said something immediately about the man who stepped out of it. He was perhaps 50. Pressed shirt despite the heat. The kind of smile that was perfectly assembled but didn't quite reach his eyes. He introduced himself as Boyd Mercer. Land development, local investment. Said Silas had spoken with him about the property, that there was already an agreement in principle, that the outstanding debts on the land were considerable, and Silas's position was difficult, and he had a very fair offer on the table that would clear the debts entirely and leave Silas with something to live on. He said all of this pleasantly, with his hands in his pockets, looking not at her, but past her, at the land. Nora said Silas had not mentioned any agreement. Boyd smiled again. Said Silas had a lot on his mind these days. She said she would be the caretaker of the property for the next several weeks, and that any discussions about the property's future would need to wait until Silas was in a position to have them clearly. Boyd looked at her then, for the first time directly. Something moved behind his eyes that she could not immediately name. He said, "Of course. No rush at all." He left his card on the porch rail, got back in his truck, drove away slowly. She watched him go, and the thing below her sternum, the one that had lived there quietly for 5 years, stirred like something waking up. She did not know why. Not yet. The first day was labor, pure and honest and necessary, the kind that empties your head of everything except what your hands are doing. She fixed the trough, mucked the cattle stalls, patched 2 fence lines with wire she found coiled in the equipment shed, fed the chickens, inventoried the hay. Silas had left a handwritten note on the kitchen table with instructions for each animal, written in the careful letters of a man whose hands no longer cooperated perfectly with his intentions. She read it twice, followed it to the letter. Near the bottom of the note, almost as an afterthought, in smaller writing that felt different from the rest, more careful, like he had written it and then decided to make the letters as small as possible. Ranger is in the rear stall of the main barn. Do not open his stall. Do not attempt to move him or turn him out. He is unpredictable and has injured 2 people already this year. Just make sure he has hay and water twice daily. Slide everything through the lower gate. Do not go inside. She did not go inside. Not the first time. The rear stall was separated from the rest of the barn by a heavy wooden partition that Silas had apparently built as a modification. Newer wood than the rest. The nails still bright. There was a reinforced gate with a sliding bolt and a small lower hatch for passing feed through. She slid the hatch open, pushed a full hay net through, heard movement inside, heavy footsteps on packed earth, the sound of breath. She slid the water bucket through and closed the hatch, and stood there a moment, listening. Ranger paced. She could hear it, the 4-beat rhythm of a horse walking in too small a space, back and forth, the same path worn into the same ground. She had heard the sound of caged pacing before. In dogs at the shelter she had volunteered at briefly, and it had the same quality. Not randomness, repetition without destination. The saddest kind of movement. She left him that first day, did not look back. But she thought about it on the drive home, the sound of those footsteps, the rhythm of something that had stopped expecting anything and just kept moving because moving was the only thing it had left. She knew that feeling. She knew it precisely. The second day, she made the mistake of coming too close when she opened the hatch. Ranger slammed his shoulder into the gate so hard, the bolt jumped in its housing. She stepped back fast, heart in her throat before she'd had time to think. She stood there breathing. Inside, Ranger blew a heavy breath through his nostrils, paced away, came back, and pressed himself against the gate again. Not striking this time, just pressing, with a kind of desperate weight that was different from aggression, more complicated than that. She looked through the gap between the gate boards. He was bigger than she had imagined. 16 hands at least, black coat with a deep brown undertone in the light, a wide chest, a neck that curved with power that had nowhere to go. His mane was tangled. He had not been brushed in some time. There were the scars she had seen from a distance, running from his left shoulder down across his chest in uneven lines, old enough to be pale against his coat. Too many, too irregular, to be from a single accident. He looked at her through the gap, not at the door, not at the hatch, at her. The way an animal looks when it is deciding whether the human in front of it is a threat or something else it doesn't yet have a category for. She did not look away, did not speak to him, did not coo or comfort. She just met his eyes and let the silence be what it was. After a long moment, he turned away, went to his water bucket. She took that as something. The days that followed had a rhythm. Mornings, she worked the cattle and the chickens and repaired whatever she found broken. Afternoons, she did the heavier things, re-fencing, clearing the drainage ditch along the north field that had silted up, hauling broken branch sections from the barn roof area into a pile for burning. She was 62 years old, and her back reminded her of this without mercy. But she kept moving because stopping was worse. She called Silas every evening. He sounded thinner each time, not in voice exactly, in energy, the way a person sounds when the body is consuming itself to keep the important parts running. She did not tell him about Boyd Mercer. She should have. She had not decided yet why she was waiting. Boyd had driven past the property twice that she had noticed. Slow, not stopping. The white truck visible through the trees at the end of the drive. Both times in the early evening when the light was going. Both times she had been in the yard and watched him pass and felt nothing she could clearly name. Just the awareness of being observed. The way you feel weather before you see clouds. On the fourth evening after dark, she sat on an overturned grain bucket outside Ranger's partition with her boots off and her feet sore and her hands scraped along the knuckles from fence wire. The barn smelled of hay and animal and old wood. The single bare bulb at the far end threw long shadows over everything. She was not thinking of anything in particular. She was very tired, and in that tired, unguarded place, the way a word you have been trying to remember surfaces only when you stop trying. She let out a breath that shaped itself into 3 notes. Low, a step up, a curl back down. The whistle she and Owen had invented in a summer when he was 9 years old. In a field she no longer owned because they had sold the old property after the move. She could not remember exactly what the whistle had started as. A game, probably. A signaling thing between a mother and a child who ran too far from sight. It had become something else over the years. A hello, a check-in, a thing that meant I'm here. Are you there? She had not made that sound since the day before the accident. She had not planned to make it now. It simply came. And Ranger stopped. The pacing stopped. The shuffling stopped. The constant low sound of a restless animal stopped completely. And the barn went so quiet she could hear the moths hitting the light bulb at the far end. Then she heard him come toward the gate. Not rushing. Not the explosive charge of the second day. Walking, deliberately, slowly placing each hurdle with care. She sat still on the grain bucket, waited. His nose appeared at the gap in the gate boards. He was breathing in long, slow pulls, reading the air, reading her. She watched him and did not move. After a long time, she let out the 3 notes again, quiet as a question. His ears came forward, both of them, orienting toward the sound like 2 antennas finding a signal, and then he pressed his cheek against the gate boards. Not straining, not fighting, just resting. The way an exhale changes the shape of a thing. Something in Nora's throat tightened. She blinked, looked at her own hands, could not for the life of her understand what had just happened, or why it felt like it mattered more than anything had mattered in a very long time. She could not leave it alone. This was not a decision. It was not a deliberate investigation. It was the way the old pressure under her sternum woke up and started pressing against her ribs from the inside and would not let her rest. She tested it the next morning, stood outside the gate before she slid the feed through, and waited until Ranger was pacing. Until he was in that restless mechanical rhythm of a creature that had stopped expecting anything. Then she whistled. He froze mid-stride, turned, came to the gate at a walk. She did it again in the afternoon from further away, from outside the barn entirely, and heard through the wall a sound that was definitely him reacting. Footsteps moving toward her direction, a soft vocalization that was not distress. She did it a third time after dark. 3 notes barely audible while she was standing 6 feet from the gate. He came all the way to the boards, put his nose through the gap, breathed against her hand. She let him. The whistle was not a sound she had ever taught anyone else. It was not a signal from a training manual or an old trick she had picked up somewhere. It was invented, private, specific. It had existed between her and Owen and nowhere else in the world. So how did a horse that had never met her son know it? She sat with that question through most of a sleepless night, and by morning she had decided she needed to look at the records. She went through Silas's office the next day. It was a small room off the main house kitchen, cluttered the way old men's offices are cluttered. Accumulation over intention. She told herself she was looking for the insurance papers and the land title documents and the veterinary records, all things she legitimately needed. She found those things. She also looked for anything to do with Ranger. There were purchase records. Silas had acquired Ranger through a livestock relocation company out of San Marcos. The seller was listed under a company name she did not recognize. There was a price paid and a date signed, and a laminated health certificate from a veterinarian in a town called Kettle Falls. The date on the purchase record, December 8th. She had to sit down. She was sitting in Silas's old rolling chair in the dusty quiet of his office, staring at that date. Because the accident had been November 14th. The funeral had been November 21st. And December 8th was 17 days after she had stood in the cold and watched them lower her husband and her son into the same cemetery plot on a hill with a view of the valley they had all chosen together. It was not conclusive. She knew that. She was not irrational. 17 days was a coincidence, or it was something else, and she had no way to know which. But the thing below her sternum had stopped being cold. It was something else now, something with heat in it. She went back to the barn. She opened the gate. She had not planned this either. She told herself she was checking his water. She had the feed bucket in one hand, and she was moving with calm, deliberate steps, and Ranger stood at the back of the stall, watching her, with that particular watchfulness, not fear, calculation. She moved slowly to his left side and ran her palm along his neck. He let her. She moved along his side, down toward his chest, and she felt the topography of the old scars under her fingers. Raised, ridged, irregular. She had thought from a distance they were bite marks or wire cuts. Up close, they were neither. The pattern was wrong for both. She crouched down, ignoring the protest of her knees, and looked along Ranger's chest. The scars ran in a diagonal pattern that crossed itself in two places. Impact scars. Not linear, not puncture. The kind that metal makes against flesh, when metal and flesh meet at speed. She had seen that pattern once before, in the photographs from the accident. Robert's car, their old Subaru wagon, blue, had been photographed from every angle for the insurance report. And she had gone through those photographs more times than was healthy, looking for the thing no one else was looking for. The left front panel of the car had been destroyed, crumpled inward and down by the impact of a larger vehicle striking it from the left side and rear before the car went off the road. The pattern of that crushed metal, the specific angles, the crossing marks. She had memorized them without meaning to. She was crouching in the stall of a barn in Harrow County, Texas, with her hand on a horse's scarred chest. And she was looking at the same pattern. She stood up, stood very still. Ranger turned his head and pressed his nose gently against her shoulder. She put her hand flat on his face. Her voice, when it came, was barely a sound. "What happened to you?" He did not answer. Of course he did not answer, but he stayed. He pressed his weight toward her, carefully, the way a large animal learns to press carefully when it knows it could hurt and has decided not to. She whistled 3 notes. He turned his face into her neck and breathed. She went back to the records that night, found Silas's handwriting in a folder she had not thought to open before. A journal of sorts. Brief daily entries about the farm, feed costs, weather, repairs. The writing of a man who had kept notes his whole life and kept them still from habit even when his hands made it difficult. She read backward from the most recent entries. And in an entry dated December 12th, 4 days after the purchase record, she found it. Ranger arrived today. BM says keep him in rear stall. No contact with visitors. Says the animal is dangerous. But I know a broken thing from a dangerous one. They are not the same. God forgive me. They are not the same. She read it 3 times. B.M. Boyd Mercer. She put the journal down on the kitchen table. Her hands were not entirely steady. Outside the window through the trees at the end of the drive, she could see the pale glow of headlights. A vehicle, idling, no movement. She watched it for 2 full minutes. Then the headlights went out. The engine sound faded. She did not sleep that night. She lay in Silas's spare room in the dark with the journal on the bedside table. And she thought about Ranger pacing in that rear stall for nearly 2 years. Back and forth. The same path, the same ground. A creature that had been carrying something it had no language for. And waiting, without knowing it was waiting, for the one sound that meant something. She thought about Owen, about the summer he was 9, about the field behind their old house, where the grass grew tall enough to swallow a boy whole, and she would whistle and listen for him coming back through the green. Always heard him before she could see him. The rustling, the footsteps. Then his face appearing at the edge of the tall grass, sweaty and pleased with himself for making her wait. She thought about the last thing she had said to him, the day before the accident, a small, unnecessary argument about a borrowed tool that was never returned. She had been sharper than the situation required. Owen had shrugged it off the way he always did, easy and unhurried, the way he moved through the world in general. She had carried that exchange for 5 years like a stone under her tongue. She thought about a horse that had heard that whistle somewhere, somehow, in the hours or days before everything changed, and kept it, tucked in whatever place animals keep the things that have mattered, past explanation, past reason, just kept. He knows what was lost, she thought. He knows it the way I know it. And then she stopped thinking and just lay in the dark with that for a long time. The ceiling above her was old plaster with a water stain in the corner shaped like nothing in particular. The night outside was very quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists in places far enough from town that the land has room to breathe. Tomorrow she would call Silas. Tomorrow she would ask him what he knew. But tonight she lay still and let herself feel for the first time in nearly 5 years not the cold certainty of something uncounted, but the warmer and more frightening certainty of something about to be found. She called Silas at 5 in the morning, not because she planned to, because she had been awake since 2 and the journal was still on the bedside table, and the name B.M. had been sitting behind her eyes all night, like a splinter she couldn't reach. The phone rang 4 times. He answered on the 4th, voice thick with medication and early waking, the sound of a man being pulled up from somewhere deep. Silas. Nora. A pause, the careful kind. You're up early. I read your journal. Silence, not the silence of someone thinking, the silence of someone
who has been waiting for a specific knock on a specific door for a very long time and is now deciding whether to open it.
The entry about BM, she said. I know it was Boyd Mercer. More silence. And I found the purchase record, she said. December 8th. 17 days after the funeral, she heard him breathe, long and slow, the kind of breath that costs something. "Lock the doors," he said. "Silas, lock the doors and don't leave the property tonight. I mean it. I understand, but I need you to tell me what you know." Another pause, longer this time, and then he did. He had not known at first. He said that clearly. He wanted her to understand that. He had believed what Boyd told him, that the horse was a problem animal, picked up cheap at an auction, needed somewhere to stay while Boyd arranged a buyer. That was the story in early December, nearly 2 years ago, when Boyd Mercer drove up with a trailer and asked Silas to board Ranger in the back stall, in exchange for the boarding and for Silas's discretion, which Boyd called a small personal favor. Boyd had settled nearly 8 months of outstanding feed bills. Silas had needed the money. The medical debt was already beginning. He had not asked questions, but the horse was wrong from the beginning. Too frightened, too scarred, too particular in his terror. Not the generalized skittishness of a poorly trained animal. Something sharper, more specific. The kind of fear that has an address. Silas had noticed. He had started to wonder. Then Boyd began coming by more often, asking questions that should not have required asking. Had anyone visited the property lately? Had Nora come around at all since the accident? Was she the sort to investigate things? Silas had thought that was an odd way to put it. Was she the sort to investigate things? He had started listening differently after that, to things people said around town about the accident 5 years ago, about Harrow Road, about the fact that the road had been torn up and resurfaced just 3 weeks after the accident. A project applied for and approved with unusual speed. Boyd's company had submitted the resurfacing contract within days of the accident and received it within days of that. He had put together a shape, not proof, just a shape. Boyd Mercer had been at a county contractor's dinner the night of November 14th. The dinner had gone late. Boyd had been drinking. Not enough for anyone to call it drunk. Enough that people remembered it. People who had not thought to say so to anyone official, because Boyd Mercer was a useful man in a small county, and the accident had been ruled an accident, and that had seemed clean enough. Nora. Silas's voice had gone quieter, worn down to something essential. I am sorry. I am sorry I did not go to someone when I started to understand. I was sick, and I was scared, and I told myself I did not have enough. But I had enough. I just didn't have the courage. She was standing in the kitchen, phone against her ear, looking at the window where the first gray light was beginning to separate the tree line from the sky. She said, "Was Ranger in Boyd's truck that night?" A long breath. "I think so," Silas said. "I think Boyd was hauling him somewhere when the collision happened. The animal got loose in the chaos somehow. Through the trailer gate. I don't know exactly. And Boyd had the horse. Maybe in the confusion. Maybe he went back after. And he needed somewhere to put him that wasn't traceable. Somewhere the horse would just disappear. And you let him. It was not an accusation. It came out flat. Just the shape of the fact. And I let him, Silas said. God help me. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, There's something else, isn't there? The silence that followed was different from the others. Heavier. The silence of a man carrying a specific weight he has not yet set down. Silas.
There is a man I know,
He said slowly.
retired from the medical examiner's office in Tarrant County. Name is Hargrove. He did me a favor 6 months ago. Before I got too sick to think straight about any of it, I asked him to look at the original accident file. Just look, not officially, just a friend reading a document. Nora did not move.
He found something, Silas said, in the original report. A note from the pathologist, small, written in the margins of the internal documentation, not included in the summary report that went to the family. Tell me, Nora. Tell me, Silas, he told her. Owen Calloway had shown significant signs of survival in the period following the initial impact. The car had gone into the ravine. The collision had been severe, but Owen had not died from the collision itself. He had lived. For some time after the vehicle came to rest at the bottom, long enough that the cause of death was ultimately attributed to secondary factors. Exposure, internal bleeding untreated, not the impact. What came after the impact? How long? She said. Her voice was very quiet. Hargrove couldn't say precisely without reopening the official examination. But he was certain it was significant. Long enough that someone who had stayed, someone who had called for help, could have made a difference. On a wet road on a November night on a curve that Boyd Mercer knew he had caused, that he had stopped to assess, that he had looked down into and left. Nora stood at the kitchen window. The light was coming in pale and flat now. The yard outside was wet with dew. The old sycamore at the corner of the fence line stood very still in the windless early morning. Everything looked the same as it had looked yesterday. Everything looked completely different. She was aware that her hand on the counter was pressing down very hard. Aware that if she relaxed it, she was not sure what would happen. So she kept pressing. All right, she said. Nora, what are you going to do? I'm going to take care of the farm. She ended the call. She stood in the kitchen and breathed for a long time with her eyes closed. 1 minute, 2, just breathing. The way you hold a thing still before you decide what to do with it. Then she went to the barn. She opened Ranger's stall gate and stepped inside, and she brushed him for the first time. Long, slow strokes along his back and sides and haunches. working through the tangles in his mane with her fingers. Patient work. The kind that asks nothing and gives something anyway. He stood completely still for it, only occasionally turning his head to look back at her, as if confirming she was still there. She whistled softly. 3 notes, barely audible. He exhaled through his nose and dropped his head lower. She thought about Owen, about the summer he was 9, about the way he used to run too far in the fields behind the old house, and she would whistle and listen for him coming back. Always heard him before she could see him. Then his face appearing at the edge of the tall grass, sweaty and grinning and entirely unrepentant about how long he had made her wait. She thought about the last thing she had said to him, the small argument, the borrowed level. She had been sharper than the situation required. Owen had shrugged it off the way he always did, easy and unhurried. She had carried that for 5 years like a stone under her tongue. She thought about what Silas had told her. She thought about what it means to be alone at the bottom of a ravine in the dark in November. She started to think about whether Owen had called out, whether he had heard anything above him on the road. She stopped that line of thinking, not because it was wrong to think it, but because it was not useful right now. And right now, she needed to be useful. She finished brushing Ranger, stepped back and looked at him. He looked back at her, steady, patient, the scars on his chest pale in the barn light. "We're going to figure this out," she said. Not to him exactly, to herself, to the barn, to whatever was listening, to Owen maybe. She was not sure of the metaphysics, but she said it anyway. She had also in the 3 days following the call with Silas done other things. She had called Deputy Merritt Vane at the Harrow County Sheriff's Office. Merritt had been in the same graduating class as Owen. She remembered him at the funeral. Young, quiet, standing at the back in his uniform with his hat in his hands. She had told him everything, the purchase record, the journal entry, the timeline, the scars. Hargrove's informal findings about the accident file. Merritt had listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to be straight with you, Mrs. Calloway. Boyd Mercer is a prominent name in this county. I can't move on this through normal channels without something more concrete. But what you're describing is enough to make me look. Really look. And I'm going to make a call or two." She asked who he was going to call. He said, "Someone who's been watching a different pattern. One I think might connect." She did not ask more than that. She trusted the careful way he said it. The way a young man talks when he is taking something seriously and doesn't want to oversell what he can deliver. She had also moved Ranger to the larger stall near the barn's main doors, replaced the bolt on his gate with a heavier sliding model, installed every motion sensor light she could find in Silas's equipment shed, aimed them at the driveway and the barn approach, located Silas's medical alert button and reconfigured it to dial the sheriff's dispatch directly.
put it in the front pocket of her jeans every morning when she got dressed, just in case.
She was not the kind of woman who waited for things to happen to her. She had learned that about herself over the past 5 years. Not during the grief exactly, during the long quiet after the grief. When she had realized that the part of her that kept waking at 3 in the morning with that familiar pressure under her sternum was not broken, was not disordered, was not as several well-meaning people had suggested something she should speak to someone about. It was paying attention. It had always been paying attention, and it had been right. Boyd came back on a Friday afternoon. He stood on the porch with a folder under his arm and the assembled smile in its usual position. Said he wanted to help. Said Silas's situation was truly unfortunate. Said he had spoken with the bank. Said there was really only one clean path forward. Said he had made the documents as simple as possible. He held out the folder. She looked at it, did not take it. What exactly is this? Sale of property, fair price given the debt attached. Silas gets out clean. Silas hasn't authorized a sale. Silas is a very sick man, Nora. He needs things simplified. She looked at Boyd Mercer then, really looked, at the pressed shirt and the careful smile and the hands that were perfectly still at his sides. The hands of a man who had learned to make his body say one thing while his mind was doing another. She said, "I'll simplify things for you, Boyd. I know about the horse. I know where he came from." His face did not change the way she expected. The smile stayed exactly where it was, but something underneath it changed. The thing behind the smile went cold and very still, like a body of water when something large has moved below the surface. He said, "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." He said, "Nora, you've been isolated a long time. Grief does things to the mind. You start finding meaning in things that aren't there. It's natural. It's understandable." She heard the condescension in it, the practiced kind, the kind you prepare in advance, for when you need a woman to feel foolish enough to stop asking questions. She said, "He reacts to a whistle my son made up when he was 9 years old." Boyd said nothing. "He has impact scars that match the damage pattern on my husband's car." "That's not evidence of anything." "It's enough to reopen an investigation." He took a small step forward on the porch. Something about the angle of his body changed. The shoulder coming forward, the weight redistributing, small adjustments that happen below conscious decision. She noticed it the way you notice a shift in weather before you consciously identify the clouds. He said, "You should take the deal. It's a good offer. Silas gets something. You go back to your house and everyone moves on." "Everyone has been moving on for 5 years," she said. "I'm the only one who hasn't managed it." "Sign the papers, Nora. Get off this porch." He did not get off the porch. He stood there with the flat, patient look of a man who believes he will get what he wants.
because he has always gotten what he wants. Then he folded the papers back into the folder and tucked it under his arm. "I'll be back," he said. He left.
She closed the door, stood in the hallway, listened to his truck start and pull away slowly, listened until the sound was gone completely, and there was nothing left but the distant sound of cattle and the creak of the house in the afternoon heat. Then she let the shaking move through her arms and hands, and then stopped. She was not afraid of him. Not exactly. She was afraid of what he was capable of, which was different. A man afraid of being exposed was more dangerous than a man who simply wanted something. Wanting was manageable. Fear was not. She called Merritt Vane, told him Boyd had come with papers, told him about the conversation, told him about the way Boyd's body had changed on the porch. She did not say she was frightened. She did not need to. Merritt said, "I made that call, the one I mentioned." And there's a state-level investigator, economic crimes and public contracting. She's been building a file on a pattern of county land deals and zoning approvals connected to Mercer land development for about 8 months. The accident wasn't part of what she was looking at, but when I described the timeline to her, December 8th, the resurfacing contract, she got very quiet. Nora was quiet too.
"She's coming down next week," Merritt said. "But Nora, I need you to be careful between now and then. Can you do that?"
"Yes," she said. She asked him the same question she had asked before. If something happened tonight, if she activated the alert, how long?
15 minutes if we're already on the county road, he said. Maybe 20 from town.
She said she understood. She had already done the math. The storm came in from the southwest just after 10 that night. She heard it before she saw it. The particular tone the wind makes when it shifts from complaint to intention. The sky outside the kitchen window went the color of old iron. Then the first rain hit the glass in one flat sheet, and the lights flickered. Once held. She turned off every light in the house, sat in the dark kitchen, and listened to the storm. She thought about Owen, not the accident, not Hargrove's findings, not Boyd Mercer, just Owen, the specific quality of him, the way he laughed. A sound that started low and built slowly and ended with him shaking his head like he couldn't believe something was that funny. The way he made coffee in her kitchen, always too strong, always without apology. The way he said her name, Mom, 2 letters, 1 syllable, the most ordinary word in the language, and somehow irreplaceable. She thought about Carrie, about the baby that had existed for 6 weeks and then not existed, about all the futures that had been in that car on Harrow Road and had gone over the edge with it. She thought about Silas lying in a hospital bed in Dallas, old and thin and sick. a good man who had done a wrong thing for a human reason. Fear, debt. The particular paralysis of a person who knows something terrible and can't find a way to hold it that doesn't destroy everything else. She did not blame him. She understood him. Understanding a thing was not the same as excusing it, but it made room for something that simple anger could not. The rain intensified, beat the roof like it meant something personal. And then she heard the truck. 11:40. No headlights. The sound of the engine low and careful. She almost missed it under the rain. But she had been listening for it the way you listen for something when you already know it is coming. She heard the crunch of gravel at the far end of the drive. The engine cut. A door. She pressed the alarm button once. One press for standby alert. 2 presses for immediate response. 1 press. She was already moving through the back of the house, through the kitchen door, across the yard in the rain, moving along the wall in the dark. The motion sensor lights did not trip because she stayed outside their range. She had memorized that range over the past 2 days. She was inside the barn before Boyd made it to the porch and found the house dark and empty. The barn was black. A single emergency light over the main door ran on battery backup. Dim, red glow. The kind that makes everything look like the inside of something very old. Ranger was awake. She could hear him shifting in his stall. Not panicked. Alert. He had heard the truck. She stood in the center of the barn floor, and she waited. The side door opened. Boyd came in with a flashlight in one hand. He swept it around the space, moved it across the stalls, the old equipment hanging from the wall, the hay bales stacked along the far side. Found her. He was also holding a pistol. The flashlight beam held on her face. She didn't raise her hand against it. He said, "I don't want to do this." She said nothing. "This was all manageable," he said. "You made it unmanageable." She looked at him in the red-tinged dark. At the gun. At the flashlight. At the face of a man who had made one terrible choice and spent 5 years making smaller terrible choices to protect it. The kind of accumulation that changes a person's shape from the inside. Makes them someone they did not intend to be. She said, "How long have you known it wasn't just an accident?" "From the beginning." A pause. "Obviously from the beginning." "Tell me what happened." "Why?" "Because I have been carrying the weight of not knowing for 5 years," she said. "And you have been carrying the weight of knowing, and I think it is very heavy." Something shifted in him. She had gambled on it, had gambled on the particular loneliness of a man who had kept a secret this large for this long. The way a terrible weight eventually becomes a terrible need. The need to put it down, even once, even in the worst possible circumstance. He lowered the gun slightly, and he began. The road was wet. He had been drinking, not enough to call it drunk. Not so little that it wasn't a factor. He was hauling Ranger north to his property. A cheap buy from an auction he'd stumbled into. No real reason behind it, just an impulse purchase. He came around the curve on Harrow Road too fast. He clipped their car from behind on the left side. The Subaru went through the guardrail. He stopped, got out, walked to the edge. He could see the car below, the headlights still on, tilted at an angle, one wheel spinning slowly. He waited. His voice was flat now, stripped of the surface polish. What was underneath was not much. A man with a calculation where a conscience should have been. "If I'd called it in," he said. "If I'd stayed, everything was gone. 3 county contracts I'd spent 6 years building. The land deal going through the commissioner's office. 1 phone call and none of it exists anymore." She said, "So you left them there?" "The rain was getting worse. You left them there." He said nothing. She said very quietly, "Owen was alive when that car went into the ravine. He was alive for significant time after the impact, long enough that help could have reached him. You know that. You were standing at the edge of that road." Boyd's hand with the gun came back up. She looked at him and did not look away. And she let him see that she was not going to look away. That whatever happened next was not going to change the fact that she knew. That Merritt Vane knew. That Hargrove had documented it. That the shape of what he had done existed now outside of just his own head and hers. It was in the world, and it would stay in the world. He said, "Sign the papers, Nora. I have them here. You sign. I file Silas's estate into receivership, and all of this stays what it was ruled 5 years ago." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "It was never going to stay anything," and she filled her lungs, and she whistled. 3 notes, low, up, curling long back down. She put everything into it, every field, every morning, every one of the 31 years she had made that sound in the air of whatever world she and Owen were sharing at the time. She whistled it the way you call back something that has been gone too long. The way you say, "I'm here." "Are you there?" The way you say, "Come home." Ranger exploded through the stall gate. The bolt was new, heavy sliding steel. She had replaced it herself 4 days ago, but the force behind it was not something a bolt could hold. The gate swung and crashed against the wall, and Ranger came through it at a speed that the narrow barn aisle translated into something enormous, something unstoppable, a black shape moving fast in the red-tinged dark. He knew. She would think about this later, the knowing. How a horse arrived at the specific geometry of recognition in 2 seconds in a dark barn in a rainstorm. Whether animals carry certain memories in a place below thought. The way fear bypasses reason. Whether the smell of a man, the angle of a silhouette, the presence in that particular air of the thing
that had caused the worst moment of an animal's life could be communicated faster than any conscious process.
She did not know. What she knew was that Ranger hit Boyd Mercer with his shoulder. Not a kick, not a rearing strike, a body blow, at a run. The full weight of 1,200 pounds redirected from the gate into the man standing in the center of the barn floor. The gun fired. The shot went into the rafters. She heard it, the roar in the enclosed space, and then the smaller sound of wood splintering above. And then Boyd was down.
Ranger stood over him, not attacking, standing, the way a horse stands when it has said what needed saying and is waiting to see if it was understood. Boyd was on his back, the gun out of his reach. He was making the low sound of a man who has had the air knocked completely out of him. He turned his head and looked up at the horse standing over him, and he went very still. Nora pressed the alarm button twice. Then she stood in the center of the barn with her hand on Ranger's neck. The rain hammered the roof. Ranger did not move. Boyd did not move. She looked down at Boyd Mercer in the red-tinged dark, at the man who had driven away from the edge of a ravine on a November night. The man who had spent 5 years making sure the world believed it was an accident, who had boarded a horse in a stranger's back stall and paid for silence and driven past this property again and again, watching to make sure the silence held. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. She had expected rage, or something like triumph, or the relief of a pressure finally released. What she felt was quieter than any of those things. It was the old, familiar weight under her sternum, going warm for the first time. Not gone, not resolved, just warm. The way the first light of a winter morning touches frost on glass and begins very slowly to change it. Something had been found, not fixed, not healed. Found. She kept her hand on Ranger's neck and she waited. 14 minutes later, she heard the sheriff's department come up the drive. Merritt Vane was not the only one who came. The primary cruiser was followed by 2 more units and then a truck from the state police, because Merritt had made a call on the way. To the investigator who had been building a file on Boyd Mercer's land deals for 8 months and had gone very quiet when she heard about the timeline. She had not gone quiet because she was surprised. She had gone quiet because she had been waiting for the thread that would pull everything together. And here it was, 17 days after a funeral. A horse in a back stall. A woman who had refused to stop knowing something was wrong. Boyd was taken from the barn in handcuffs, still pale, still watching Ranger with an expression Nora did not try to interpret. He said nothing useful until he had a lawyer, which took until the following morning. Then the lawyer arrived, and Boyd Mercer began making decisions about what he was willing to say. He said enough,
or so Nora thought. 3 days later, Merritt Vane called her at 7 in the morning. She was in the barn, brushing Ranger the way she did every morning now. Long, slow strokes along his back and sides. He stood completely still for it, head low, ears soft. She picked up the phone with her free hand. "There's a problem," Merritt said. She kept brushing. "Tell me." Boyd's lawyer filed a motion last night, the barn confession. He's arguing it was coerced, no law enforcement present, no Miranda. Bystander with an alleged weapon in the form of a 1,200-pound horse. She almost laughed. Almost. "He's calling a horse a weapon." "He's calling a horse a weapon." She set the brush down. "And the rest of it," she said. "The journal, the purchase record, the scars." "Silas's journal is personal opinion, not admissible as direct evidence of involvement. The purchase record establishes a transaction, legal on its face. The scars on Ranger." A pause. "His lawyer is calling it speculation, pattern matching by a grieving woman." Grieving woman. That phrase landed somewhere specific, in the same place another phrase had landed 5 years ago, when a deputy she didn't know had sat across from her in a cold office and told her loss of control on a wet road, and looked at her in a way that meant the conversation was over. Grief does things to the mind. You start finding meaning in things that aren't there. She had heard that her whole life in one form or another, from people who meant well, from people who didn't. The underlying message always the same. Your instincts are symptoms. Your certainty is a condition. Go home. Take something for it. Stop. She had almost stopped, more than once. "So what do we have?" she said. Merritt was quiet for a moment. "Enough to hold him on the trespass and weapons charges. Enough to keep the investigation open. But Nora, for criminal charges that stick, for vehicular homicide and obstruction, we need something the defense can't dismiss as the interpretation of a grieving woman." She heard what he wasn't saying, that this could still fall apart, that Boyd Mercer could walk out of this with a trespass charge and a fine, that he could rebuild his smile and his contracts and his white truck and drive past Coldwater Ranch for another 5 years, that the truth could be found and still not be enough. "I need to read the original accident file," she said. "Nora." "The complete file, not the summary. Everything collected at the scene, every technician's note, every photograph, everything." Silence on his end, the kind that meant he was already calculating what it would cost him. "I'll get it to you by end of day," he said. The file arrived at 4 in the afternoon. Merritt brought it himself, a manila folder thick enough to suggest a decade of neglect rather than 5 years. He set it on Silas's kitchen table and looked at her. "You sure about this?" "No," she said. "Get some coffee if you want." He sat. She opened the folder. She had seen some of these photographs before. The insurance company had sent a set. The car from 4 angles, the guardrail, the road surface. She had studied those photographs until she knew every crease and fold of that crumpled metal the way she knew the lines of her own hands. These were different photographs, more of them, wider angles, the ravine floor, the approach, the road surface documented in sections, and then the technician's field notes, handwritten, page after page of the precise, careful language of someone trained to record without interpretation. She read slowly, turned each page. Merritt refilled his coffee cup and said nothing. She was on the 14th page when she found it. A single paragraph, tucked between a notation about debris scatter and a measurement of the distance between the guardrail break and the car's final position. Written in cramped handwriting, a professional observation that had not seemed significant enough to include in the summary report. Object recovered from mud at base of ravine east of vehicle. Plastic fragment approximately 4 inches in diameter. Industrial finish. Retains partial manufacturer's coating consistent with commercial vehicle undercarriage treatment. Labeled non-relevant. Stored evidence box 7 to 14. She stopped. Read it again. Industrial finish. Undercarriage treatment. Commercial vehicle. Not a piece of the Subaru. The Subaru was a family sedan. Factory paint. No industrial undercarriage coating. This fragment had come from something else. Something larger. Something that used the kind of heavy-duty protective finish applied to work trucks and contractor vehicles. Box 7-14. She looked up at Merritt. He read her face. What? She put her finger on the paragraph. He leaned forward. Read it. Read it again. Then sat back in his chair with the expression of a man who has just felt the ground shift slightly under his feet. Evidence box 7-14, he said. Is it still in county storage? If it was never flagged for disposal. He was already pulling out his phone. Hold on. She watched him make the call, listened to the careful way he explained what he was looking for. The pause while someone on the other end went to check. The longer pause. Then, it's there. She exhaled. Just that. One breath, steady and slow. 5 years, Merritt said. Never analyzed, never followed up on because the accident was ruled non-criminal and there was no reason to. There's a reason now, she said. The analysis took 11 days. Nora knew about waiting. She had been waiting in one form or another for nearly 5 years. 11 days was almost easy by comparison. She kept working the farm, fed the cattle, fixed the section of east fence the Hears had been leaning on all week, cleaned the chicken coop, called Silas every evening and listened to his voice getting thinner. Not in sadness, in the way voices get thin when the body is making hard choices about where to put its remaining energy. She brushed Ranger every morning and every evening. He was different now from the horse she had met 3 weeks ago. Still watchful. Still particular about who came near him. When a county extension officer stopped by on an unrelated matter and walked toward the barn, Ranger screamed and kicked the wall hard enough to drop dust from the rafters. But with Nora, he was steady. He had started accepting sweet feed from her palm, a handful at the end of the evening brush. He would take it carefully, lips soft against her skin, and then stand with his nose near her shoulder for a moment after, not asking for more, just staying. She thought about what that meant, what it costs a creature that has been hurt badly enough to stop trusting, to choose to trust again, slowly, on its own terms, without any guarantee that the trust will be honored. She thought that was one of the braver things she had ever witnessed, and she thought she was trying to do the same thing herself. With the community that had looked at her sideways for 5 years. With Darlene Foss, who had started staying a few minutes longer when Nora came into the store. Small conversations about the weather, about the cattle, about nothing in particular, except that they were something. The beginning of something. She was not ready to call it healing. That word felt presumptuous, like putting a name on a season before it had finished arriving. But it was something. On the morning of the 12th day, Merritt called. She was in the east pasture with a fence post and a mallet. Her back was complaining. Her hands were dirty. She answered on the second ring. "The fragment," Merritt said. "The coding analysis came back." She set the mallet down. The chemical composition is consistent with a specific industrial undercarriage sealant used on commercial and contractor-grade vehicles manufactured between 2010 and 2016. One company made it, discontinued in 2017. Boyd Mercer owned a 2014 F350 at the time of the accident. She was quiet. "He sold that truck 8 months after the accident," Merritt said. "But the DMV records are complete. We have the VIN. We have documentation of the undercarriage product applied at purchase. And we have a fragment from the bottom of the ravine where your husband's car came to rest. A physical match, independent of anything you told me, independent of the journal, independent of Ranger, independent of what Boyd said in that barn." She sat down on the ground, right there in the east pasture with the fence post half driven and the mallet beside her. The October grass dry and pale around her. The sky overhead a hard, clean blue. "Is it enough?" she said. "It's enough," Merritt said. "The state investigator agrees. We're moving forward with formal charges. Vehicular homicide. Obstruction of justice. And given the resurfacing contract and the speed of that approval, possible charges related to misuse of public contracts to conceal evidence. His lawyer is going to fight it. But this is a physical match from a preserved crime scene. Juries understand physical matches." She sat in the grass for a long time after the call ended. The cattle moved somewhere in the distance. A hawk turned slow circles overhead. The wind came through the dry grass with a sound like the edge of something. She thought about a plastic fragment the size of a child's fist, sitting in a cardboard box in a county storage room for 5 years. labeled non-relevant by a technician who had no reason to think otherwise. Just sitting there in the dark, patient as a stone, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Truth does not disappear. It waits. It does not always arrive on time. It does not prevent the harm or undo the years that follow. It does not give back what was lost. But it waits. And if someone is stubborn enough to keep pressing on the thing that doesn't add up, if someone refuses to call their own certainty a symptom, it can be found. She called Silas that evening. He answered faster than usual, like he had been waiting near the phone. "Merritt called you," she said. "He called me an hour ago." A pause, the kind that meant something was being held carefully. "I don't have words for what I feel, Nora." "You don't need words." "I should have..." "Silas." He stopped. "You did," she said. "In the end, you did." He was quiet for a moment. She could hear his breathing, the careful management of it, the work it had become. "There's something else," he said. "I've spoken with my lawyer here in Dallas. I've updated my will. I want Coldwater Ranch to go to you, the full property, with whatever remains after the medical debts are settled. I've already signed the documents." "Silas, that isn't necessary." "I know it isn't necessary." Something in his voice had settled, the tone of a man who has made peace with a decision. "I want to know it goes to someone who will keep it, someone who already knows what it's worth." She looked out the kitchen window. At the yard she had repaired and cleared. At the barn roof she had patched. At the fence lines she had walked and fixed and walked again. At the place that had been abandoned and surviving and was now something else, something still becoming. "I'll keep it," she said. He died 11 days later on a Thursday morning, peacefully, which was a mercy, and she was grateful for it. The town of Sawyer's Bend came to the funeral. Not just for Silas, though they came for Silas. He had been part of the fabric of this place for decades, and the turnout was honest. But they also came for Nora, and she felt the difference. After the service, people came to her in the way a community approaches something it has handled badly and knows it. Not with speeches, not with explanations, with the simpler, more difficult thing: presence. A hand extended. Eye contact held a beat longer than usual. The acknowledgement that something real had happened, and she had carried it, and they had let her carry it alone, and they knew that now. The woman from the pharmacy who had watched Nora walk past in silence for 5 years. The man from the feed store who had processed her orders without conversation. The minister who had not seen her in a church since the memorial. They came. They said something simple and true. And they shook her hand or touched her arm. She received it. That was the only word for what she did. She opened something that had been closed for a long time, and she received it. Not because she had forgiven everything, or resolved everything, or arrived somewhere clean and finished, but because she was 62 years old, and she understood now that connection did not require the absence of pain. That community was not something that existed before the hard things. It was something you chose again, after, imperfectly, with the full knowledge that it might fail you again.
You chose it anyway. Because the alternative was the kitchen table that seated 6, and standing at the counter with a bowl of soup you sometimes forgot to taste. Merritt Vane found her after the graveside service. He had his hat in his hands, the way she remembered him at Robert and Owen's funeral all those years ago. Young then, still young now to her eyes, but different. The kind of different that happens when someone has done something that cost them something and found they could bear the cost. "The state investigator wanted me to tell you something," he said. She waited. "She said without your documentation, the journal, the photographs of Ranger's scars, the purchase records, the timeline you put together, there was nothing to work with. The fragment in the box doesn't matter if no one goes looking for it, and no one goes looking for it without a reason." He paused. "You were the reason." She thought about what to say. "There was a horse," she said finally. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face that she couldn't fully read. Something between admiration and something older. The recognition of a truth he would carry forward. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "There was a horse." The indictment came on a Tuesday. She heard about it sitting in Silas's kitchen with a cup of coffee made in Silas's old percolator. The one that took 11 minutes and made coffee strong enough to hold a spoon upright. She had grown to like it that way. She sat with the news for a long time. She did not cry. The weight under her sternum. The faithful companion of 5 years. Went quiet for the first time she could remember. Not gone. Quiet. The way a storm goes quiet after it has done what it came to do. Multiple counts. Vehicular homicide. Obstruction of justice. Misuse of public contracting. Boyd Mercer's lawyer would fight it. The trial would take time. There would be days when the outcome felt uncertain, and days when it felt certain, and days when she would not be able to think about it at all, because thinking about it took more than she had to spare. She knew all of that. But the charge existed. The fact of what had happened on Harrow Road existed now in an official document, in the language of law, with Boyd Mercer's name attached to it and the date of November 14th, and the names Robert Calloway and Owen Calloway. Their names in a document that said what happened. She put her hand flat on Silas's kitchen table, scratched and stained and solid. The kind of furniture that outlasts the people who use it.
and becomes a record of them anyway. And she let herself feel for just a moment all of it. The weight of 5 years. The weight of what she had found. The weight of what could never be undone. And the particular quality of justice that arrives too late to fix anything and still matters. It still mattered. She was certain of that. She moved into Coldwater Ranch by the end of November. She kept her own house too, went back twice a week, tended it the way you tend a place that holds something irreplaceable, even when you are no longer living in it. Watered the garden, walked the rooms, stood sometimes in the hallway with her hand on Owen's coat on the hook. She had not taken it down. She thought perhaps she never would, and perhaps that was all right. Perhaps there were some things you kept not because you were unable to let go, but because letting go was not the only valid relationship you could have with something you loved. Perhaps you could hold something and still move forward. Perhaps forward did not require empty hands. The farm took most of her energy, which was what she needed. The cattle required daily attention. The winter feed stores needed calculating and ordering. The barn needed a second round of repairs before the cold set in properly. Darlene Foss started coming by on Thursday mornings with the supply orders, and then started staying for coffee, and then started organizing what became an informal rotation of community help. Different families for different days of the week. Nothing obligatory. Just the kind of help that small places give themselves when they remember how. It was not the life she had before. It was not the life she had during the grief. It was something she did not yet have a name for. Something with more space in it, more air. The way a room feels different when you open a window you did not know was there. She was not entirely okay. She knew that. She did not expect to be entirely okay. She had her bad nights, her mornings that started with the old weight back on her chest, her hands that still went sometimes to those coat hooks in the old house without her telling them to. But she had stopped punishing herself for those things. That was perhaps the most significant change. The 5 years of carrying that familiar pressure under her sternum had also involved a kind of low, ongoing judgment of herself. For grieving too long, for not moving on, for finding meaning in things that weren't there. She had internalized every careful look and every well-meaning suggestion until they had become her own voice. She was working on unhearing that voice. It was slow work, but she was doing it. On a Wednesday afternoon in late May, she was in the east pasture fixing the last section of post that the Hears had been leaning on all spring. The sun was getting low. The air had that particular quality of late Texas afternoons in May, warm and still, and carrying something sweet from whatever was blooming along the fence line. The kind of evening that doesn't ask anything of you, just exists. She finished the post, gathered her tools, walked toward the old live oak at the pasture corner, the largest tree on the property. Silas had mentioned it in his journal. Older than the fence lines, older than the ranch itself. The kind of tree that has been standing long enough to have stopped noticing what happens beneath it and simply continues. Patient, still here. She set her toolbox down at the base of it. She looked out across the open pasture. The grass was long now. The spring had been wet enough to push it high. It moved in the evening wind in slow rolling waves, gold and amber and a green so pale it was nearly white at the tips. Beautiful in a way that asked nothing of you. She thought about Owen, not the loss of him only, the specific fact of him. The early morning coffee too strong without apology. The laugh that started low and built. The way he said her name. 2 letters, 1 syllable. Irreplaceable. She thought he would have liked this farm. He would have walked the fence lines and found 3 things to fix before she finished her first cup of coffee. He would have talked to Ranger like a person, which was the only right way to talk to Ranger. He would have sat under this oak on summer evenings and said something simple and true about the light. She thought, I will tell him things out here. The way you tell things to someone when you are not sure of the metaphysics, but you do it anyway because it is the only language available. Because love does not require a confirmed address. It just requires the willingness to keep speaking. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the quarter of an apple she had brought without quite acknowledging to herself why she had brought it. Far away near the far fence in the long amber grass, a dark shape stood with its head up, watching the tree line, watching the light, watching whatever horses watch in the slow gold hour before evening. She put her fingers in her mouth the way Owen had taught her, because he had been able to do it louder than her. And he had been very proud of that difference. And she had pretended to be annoyed. And she had loved him for it. And she let out 3 notes. Low, a step up, a long curl back down. She sent them out into the evening like something she was returning to the air. For Owen, for Robert, for Silas. For every morning she had woken with the certainty that something was uncounted and kept waking and kept looking and refused to call that certainty a symptom. For herself. The woman who had stood in front of a barn in the last copper light of evening and let 3 notes leave her lips without planning to, and had her grief answered. The notes traveled across the pasture in the warm, still air. A moment. Nothing. Just the grass moving. Just the light going. And then the dark shape lifted its head, paused. A single breath of wind crossed the whole pasture, bending the amber grass in one slow wave from north to south. And Ranger came, not the explosive charge from the barn, not the desperate energy of something contained too long. The pure, clean run of a horse that knows exactly where it is going. His mane lifted behind him. His hooves through small puffs of dry earth. and the sound of them reached her in waves, steady and coming closer and unmistakable. He slowed as he neared, gallop to canter, canter to trot, and then to a walk. The last 50 feet he came slowly, with his ears forward and his eyes on her face. Just her face. Nothing else in the world at that particular moment. He came to her, and he put his nose into her chest, and she put both arms around his neck and held on. She did not cry. She had cried what needed crying. 5 years of it. The grief of losing 2 people at once. The grief of not knowing why. The grief of knowing and not being believed. The grief of the small argument she had carried under her tongue like a stone for 63 months. All of it cried, all of it real, all of it hers. This was something else. This was the thing underneath the grief. The thing that had been there before the grief and had survived the grief and would outlast it. The thing that 3 notes on an evening had somehow reached across 5 years and 1 animal's unbreakable memory to deliver back to her. Love does not end at the edge of what we can explain. She had known this once, before the accident, before the 5 years. She had known it the way you know things before life teaches you to doubt them. The way a 9-year-old boy knows it when he invents a whistle with his mother in a field and runs off into the tall grass confident that the sound will always bring him back. She had not forgotten it. She had had it pressed out of her by loss, by isolation, by every voice that told her certainty was a symptom and instinct was grief in disguise. Ranger had kept it for her all that time, in whatever place animals keep the things that have mattered, past explanation, past reason, past 5 winters and the slow dismantling of the life that built it. He kept the sound, kept the recognition, kept the response. Because some things do not require understanding to be true. Some things only require an open gate and the willingness to run toward what is calling. She stood under the old oak with her arms around his neck. The sky went purple overhead. The first stars appeared one by one above the tree line to the east, unhurried, as if they had been waiting for exactly this moment to come out. She thought of Owen. She thought, I heard you coming through the grass. I always heard you before I could see you. She thought, I found it. What was left? I found it. The stars came out over Coldwater Ranch, slow and certain. The way things return when you have stopped forcing them and simply made a place for them to land. The grass moved in the warm night air. Ranger breathed against her shoulder. And Nora Calloway stood under the oldest tree on the property and held on and let the evening be what it was.